Chapter 15. Conclusion. Will it end? Introduction. Anarchism, as a formal social, political, and intellectual movement in Europe and the United States, may be loosely dated to the second half of the 19th century. On September 6, 1901, an avowed anarchist named Leon Czolgosz shot then U.S. President McKinley at the Pan American Exposition held in Buffalo, New York. Gangrene developed, and McKinley died on September 14th of blood poisoning. Czolgosz was electrocuted on October 29th, unrepentant. By the end of World War I, this sort of anarchism was a spent force. Things with beginnings tend to have ends. So, it is tempting to ask whether terrorism itself has a history that will come to an end. If terrorism were to end, might we see the end of counterterrorism? Perhaps the entire security apparatus built to combat terror, now grown familiar, may be dismantled. By many measures, we, meaning at least privileged inhabitants of advanced economies, but maybe more than that, are safer than ever before. In some genres of social science writing, one expects to see statistics offered as evidence or even demonstration of that proposition. Statistics, of course, cannot be understood without considerable examination of how they were compiled, may easily be contested, and so forth. So we do not attempt, no doubt only to fail, to answer this question by reference to various accountings that we have read and more or less believe, as the case may be. Worse, as Weber points out in Science's Vocation, the social scientist is bound to be superseded. Temporality, even a modernist sensibility, is thus built not only into the question of whether it will end, but is built into the way such questions are approached. And this is at least analytically disturbing, because what we mean by modern lies near the heart of our inquiry. The Great Game. In the late 19th century, British and Russian forces engaged in a usually covert struggle for much of Asia, immortalized by Rudyard Kipling as the Great Game. World wars and a Cold War came and were said to have ended. There was a moment, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and a shallow readings of the end of history, when it seemed that peace at last had broken out, at least in civilized places. Borders might have to be redrawn somewhat. Today, British soldiers are still in Afghanistan, sometimes officially, sometimes their presence is deniable. The Russians hack elections and invade Ukraine. The Great Game continues. None of which is to say that the Great Game continues as it did back in the day. Globalization and new technologies have meant something. The murderously loud, spectacular wars of the early and mid-20th century, in which large nation-states were mobilized against others, seem to have passed from the scene. In recent years, the rumble of tanks has been heard mostly in parades and second- or third-tier conflicts, and we have yet to witness an exchange of weapons of mass destruction. Although, as with security more generally, we will not know if we were truly at peace until we are at war. As Christa Wolf said in Cassandra, how does one know when the pre-war period begins? At the present moment, violence seems fairly muted. Even drones are too loud, so that we develop glide missiles that have no motors, like murderous exploding owls. At least at the present juncture, conflicts, with and among state and non-state actors, seem to be conducted largely in the shadows. The juvenile tendency to draw equivalences among types of violence, Al-Qaeda is somehow like the U.S. support of Israel's occupation of Palestine and such like, should be resisted. Indeed, normative discussion of this or that species of violence is not the point here. The point is that violence often develops. As we have seen, the dynamic of castles and cannons, perhaps hastened in an age of technical discovery, means that violence changes and is in that sense new. But it is still violence, and is in that more fundamental sense old. And the forms do not always change. Continuing the evolutionary metaphor, perhaps more than a metaphor, other forms of violence do not change no more than cockroaches. Consider manual domestic violence or knife fights in bars. Different forms of violence, especially different weapons, are available to different sorts of actors, as in the natural world. Another point made by Kipling in the Jungle Book. In the Hobbesian tradition, violence is the occasion of politics. When life is nasty, brutish, and short in the state of nature, men sensibly surrender their liberty to Leviathan, the collective that can protect them. Conversely, the political must at least include the capacity to deliver violence, to deliver oneself from one's enemies, and thereby ensure what would come to be called security. For example, for Weber, as we have seen, The essence of the state is the effective monopoly of legitimate violence upon a territory. Weber's sometime student Carl Schmitt goes further and declares the essence of the political to be the distinction between friend and foe, and so forth. One need not go quite so far. For every Hobbes there is a Locke. Empirically, most of us do not experience much violence at all. While violence is indubitably prevalent throughout history, must it be considered essential? That is collective violence a transhistorical concept? In the sunnier precincts of Enlightenment thought, a sensible social order removes the causes for violence, and hence violence itself should evaporate. Most notably, for some generations it was widely believed that the abolition of property, an institution founded on the right to exclude other people from things and places, would lead to inclusion, solidarity, and so peace. Less radically, surely one can imagine a safe and sane society. As American anthropologist Nancy Shepard Hughes put it in the wake of the Parkland, Florida shootings, in 1941, President FDR articulated the four freedoms that all people ought to enjoy: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Our children have every right to demand that society protect them from fear and provide them with the basic trust in their ontological security in the world. Onto and ontological is from the Greek being, so ontological security is freedom to be you and me, as Marlowe Thomas and friends had it in an early 1970s children's classic. Perhaps society ought to be like lost places, such as Palma's vision of Sweden, or Norway before Breivik, or even Christchurch, New Zealand, in which the state saw itself as both very benevolent and highly enlightened, and where it was assumed that security, writ large, had been provided to all. In response to madness and loss, people understandably search for causes. As discussed in Chapter 12, survivors and especially leaders often understand bloodshed to be some sort of political speech, a more or less rational response to colonialism or racism or foreign policy or the expression of a misguided ideology, Salafism or white supremacy or eco-terrorism or what have you. Terrorists often help matters along by writing screeds providing the reasons that they have decided to slaughter strangers, perhaps posting them to social media, or at least shouting something partisan. Understanding violence as speech has the practical political advantage of creating the opportunity for leaders to do something, or at least to talk about doing something. In response to terrorist attacks, politicians often quickly move away from the attacks themselves and call for improvements to the conditions spoken about, conditions that somehow, how is always less than clear, rarely, but dramatically, give rise to what Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange called ultraviolence. Sometimes an attack often seems quite without roots or intentions beyond killing, especially in the United States. Consider the Las Vegas shooting, or any number of school shootings. Even in such cases, one hears plaintive calls for better mental health care, gun control, and a kinder and gentler internet, all of which are no doubt good ideas. In pursuit of security, the state conveniently turns outward. What is a terrorist? Are the Israelis terrorists? What causes terrorists? Islam? Salafi Islam? The internet? What is to be done? Such discussions are unavoidable, sometimes fascinating, and interminable. The game of politics continues, and one is tempted to add, the very interminable nature of violent events and endless talk gives one reason to believe it will not end. But, the true believer adds, the good society has yet to be built. Security ontology. Shifting focus from abstract terrorists or even mass killings to the security forces who oppose them and with whom one can talk, as this book has done, solves some problems and raises entirely new ones. Discussions of the nature of terrorism are almost always couched as policy discussions and therefore supposedly practical. For many, if not most practical purposes, however, the essential nature of terrorism is rather beside the point. Security forces around the world do not and cannot be expected to understand the whys and wherefores of their known adversaries, much less what motivates or even occasions new threats. Tactics are everything when confronting the bad guys. Similarly, the political discussion of the causes of terrorism and what is to be done about the situation tacitly presumes the good state trying to protect its citizens and with the agency to do so. But from a defensive posture, the state's vulnerability is the problem and the focus. The state is vulnerable to insult at many points, sometimes called critical infrastructure or senior officials. Terrorists are evanescent and often unspecified altogether, but points of vulnerability can be identified. Nor is the agency of the state to be presumed. Perhaps the state can respond, and quickly enough, to a terrorist attack, but perhaps not. You have to be lucky every time, as the IRA wrote after a failed attack. So the defenders practice, and then practice some more. As we have seen, from the perspective of the defenders, security is a horizon for thought, uncertain and hence unbounded. Events are not understood completely. Tactics evolve in ways that may not yet be imagined, and therefore must, in the event, be suffered. Fear of that eventuality leads to paranoia within reason. In practice, the pursuit of security is constrained by institutional structures, competition, and lack of resources, which is a good thing, because paranoia is not in principle constrained. The apparatus of security is designed to address, and so entails the possibility of destruction. The danger may not arise in fact. The attack may never come, but the danger is there, articulated by the security measures themselves. Ontologically secure is therefore an oxymoron. The very existence of a security apparatus means that there is danger, those threats against which the apparatus attempts to provide protection. In some circumstances, the danger may be only imagined, but a wall compels one to contemplate the possibility of invasion. That is, once security is understood as a problem, and measures are taken to ensure security, then those same measures serve as reminders of the problem itself. This is another way of understanding the sense of a fall discussed earlier. They saw that they were naked, vulnerable. After the attack, despite and because of the adoption of best practices, one is not secure. Again, ontology, theory of being, comes from the Greek to be. The practice of security, as opposed to the security wished for in the sunnier precincts of the Enlightenment, entails being aware of danger, to some degree, and fear. All the sympathy in the world, to say nothing of the data collected from CCTV and internet snooping and the like, will not solve the epistemological problem at the heart of paranoia within reason. While the official incentive to collect data is understandable, and much may be prevented, security writ large resists solution. Security is often treated as a problem that the powers that be are expected to solve, but this is a category mistake. Security cannot be solved so long as we remain participants in a state at risk of violent insult and forced to take precautions, for instance, erecting screening procedures at airports, because it could happen here. The very sort of government official who might aspire to ontological security cannot have it. For this Kafkaesque situation, a bit of Kafka. It's true that in the main things the blame rests with the government, which in the oldest empire on earth, right up to the present day, has not been able, or has, among other things, neglected to cultivate the institution of empire sufficiently clearly so that it is immediately and ceaselessly effective, right up to the most remote frontiers of the empire. On the other hand, however, there is in this also a weakness in the people's power of imagining or believing, which has not succeeded in pulling the empire out of its deep contemplative state in Peking and making it something fully vital and present in the hearts of subjects, who nonetheless want nothing better than to feel its touch once and then die from the experience. Our insecurity will not end because our state is something of a failure and may be attacked. The good society cannot do without security, even if there are no barbarians anymore. One may, for the sake of logic at least, consider two other possibilities. First, let us imagine a state that is completely successful. Here is a journalist contemplating the role of Gary Shipman, former Chief of Staff of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, then founder of Giant Oak, a government contractor providing analytical services. If public safety was the goal, the answer wasn't to stop scanning people's data. It was to do it the right way. Now, this is my theory, he told me, and you tell me if it's crazy or wrong. But I think that the better we have entity resolution, that is, the better we can compile and measure people's data, the less of a surveillance state we'll have. Once the machine is perfect, as long as you're following the rules, you won't even have to know it's there. Funk 2019. One recalls Mary Douglas, 1986. The high triumph of institutional thinking is to make the institutions completely invisible. As a practical matter, one might be skeptical of the capacity of the U.S. government, indeed any government, to do anything to the requisite degree of perfection. Nor do we have any reason to believe that governments with great power necessarily value the physical security of their territory's inhabitants. Why would they? Even if a government were to achieve such power and remain benevolent, as implied by Kafka's musing on the emperor's failings, then security would have been purchased at the cost of any sense of our own real being, which is another way of saying that our situation would be totalitarian, which nobody knew much better than Kafka. Conversely, one may imagine a failed state, a Hobbesian situation after our civilization collapses, or perhaps just a war zone. In such situations, it makes no sense to talk about security, because there is nobody to assert control, to claim responsibility for the safety of the space. By the same token, there may be violence, but because there is no state to be insulted, it is mere violence, of little significance except to the participants. What else do you expect in this hellhole? So long as we take ourselves at all seriously and have a state, we are stuck with some degree of insecurity. And on balance, that is a good thing. Intermezzo. Our optimists may, with good reason, point out that there has been a sleight of hand here. We started talking about the decline of violence and hence decreased need for security measures, including counterterrorism, but then shifted to the predicaments of the state, which was compelled to build walls, even if failing ones. Evidently, we are fated to be reminded of violence by our own imperfect security measures lest we suffer some worse fate. But how bad is this doom? Consciousness of the possibility of violence, or the coercion necessary to suppress such violence if needs be, may be enough to preclude ontological security, rather strictly speaking. But, our optimist points out, getting through security at an airport and so reminded of the possibility of a terrorist attack is hardly to be compared with being shot or blown up or having one's throat slit with a box cutter. What may be sensibly hoped by a member of the haute bourgeoisie? Is violence transhistorical, perhaps even essential to collective life, and hence to be endured now and forever? Or may we hope that violence, like so much else, has a history, a beginning, and an end? Perhaps the end might be hastened by good politics. It is too much to ask you to resolve modern political thought, our relentless optimist graciously concedes. But Weber said, "Here I stand." So where, at the end of this book, do we stand? To that little question we now turn, but begin in what is perhaps an odd place. Violence is rhetoric. Violence can be understood as a language, vide Clausewitz, and is sometimes accompanied by language, often styled as a manifesto. But it would be silly to assume that the language means what it says. Terrorists might have things to say. Killers, like other sinners, sometimes do. Any number of causes espoused by terrorists might be thoughtfully articulated. For example, Qutb's theology, at the heart of political Islam and the grandfather of Al-Qaeda, the great-grandfather of Islamic State, is at the very least interesting. But while there may be ideas here and there, the suicidal killers of innocents have engaged in madness, even if up to that point they generally behaved normally, or at least displayed no obvious pathology. One cannot assume a tight relationship between what may or may not have been said by way of political theory or justification and violence. Why should we take this attack politically seriously? Surely not due to its violence. Death does not entail political thought or require response on the level of political thought, though it may require collective action. In this regard, terrorists may be little different from floods or other natural disasters. In many cases, people want to take the politics of the killers seriously for reasons of their own. As already noted, the New York Times read the El Paso attack, in which 22 people, mostly Mexican Americans, died at the hands of a white supremacist, as a call to arms. On the Canadian border, the president of David's University used the same attack, distant though it was, as an occasion to extol our and his virtues. Such interventions are a bit tasteless, of course, but the victims and often the killer are already dead, and the attacks might as well be put to good use. For example, the suppression of white supremacy as political ideology. Similarly, progressives might be inclined to argue that inequality is a function of the neoliberal capitalist system and is expressed in the fabric of the urban form. Consider the recent building of skyscrapers for the ultra-rich in Midtown Manhattan. Extreme inequality rips the urban fabric. Society's answer is to provide security within these splintered urban fabrics. The result is secure islands, green zones, and a sea of poverty. The operational form is the militarization of everyday life. We are all living in Baghdad and Kabul now. Or, well, no. Baghdad and Kabul are violent in ways that New York and London are not. Put more structurally, the city is where trade happens, and in slightly more advanced economies, where capitalism works. The city's other great purposes are to serve as sites for religious and political life. None of these functions, trade, worship, rule, have generally had much to do with equality as such, but what equality did arise tended to arise in cities. Nor does this story told by progressives in which radical inequality fosters terrorism fit the facts very well. Terrorists are not, by and large, poor. The Las Vegas shooter was outright rich, with private planes and a network of nondescript houses. Spooky. Something else is happening on the ground, which does not mean that Hudson Yards, a secure green zone for the extremely wealthy on the west side of Manhattan, should have been built, at least not in the way it was. For decades, Olivier Roy has confronted this sort of essentialism in the context of terrorism expressed in Islamic terms, as it often is in Europe. Many people have argued that Islam is violent, intolerant, and causes terror. It is further said that fundamentalist Islam led to the overthrow of secular states and an atavistic urge to return to a medieval, that is bad, social order. Against this, Roy has argued that terrorism carried out in the name of political Islam, his phrase, deployed an essentially Soviet Leninist grammar of the state as vehicle to achieve an Islamic state. In particular, political Islam mirrored the structure of revolutionary Marxism common throughout the developing world in the post-World War II era, but without the atheism. As a result, the Muslim vocabulary masked the essentially modern and Western grammar of the political aspiration, in contrast to the political quietism of traditional Islam. Iran, Algeria, perhaps Pakistan, many European Muslims, the Taliban, and so forth were revolutionary, as that word has been used since the French Revolution, and therefore emphatically modern, not medieval. Political Islam, Roy argued, not only expressed a contemporary, as opposed to atavistic, politics, but was a language in which profound frustrations could be articulated and violent fantasies justified. In deploying ourselves, David argued, in part from Roy, that al-Qaeda was a sort of limiting case, a politics converging upon zero. Al-Qaeda was almost devoid of ambitions to rule people upon a territory. Its signature tactic, suicide bombing, was nihilistic. The point of such bombings, it was said, was the destruction of the status quo so that the caliphate might arise, echoing the old anarchist claim in which destruction was claimed to be a morally sufficient preparation for a politics yet to come. In short, bin Laden was only barely political, and therefore not much like the overtly political violence of, say, Ireland, or the political Islam of Iran, or even Somalia's al-Shabaab, which aspire to rule a territory. More recently, Roy has argued that Salafi discourse, associated with Saudi Arabia, is not the cause of recent terrorism committed by French youth, and particularly of the immigration to wage jihad in Syria and elsewhere on behalf of the bloodthirsty and ultimately nihilistic Islamic State. Roy fairly easily demonstrates both that French converts were not particularly devout Muslims and that Salafi discourse is conservative, that is, seeks to maintain an existing political situation. While it may be repressive, Salafism does not seek to end the divinely established worldly order. Islamic State, in contrast, is a cult of death, endeavoring to bring about the end of time. Thus, argues Roy, Salafis are not to blame for the rise of Islamic State in general, and in particular are not to blame for the conversion of French and Belgian youth into IS soldiers. Instead, in light of the evacuation of religion from French public life, religion has become a covert discourse. Out of sight, religious leaders need not be publicly responsible. Indeed, there is no way for them to be responsible. And so some imams are very radical indeed, and that is attractive. Islamic nihilism of the sort preached by the Caliphate has thus been adopted as the rhetoric of existentially desperate French youth. Roy mentions Durkheim's suicide at the intersection of nihilism and culture and at the birth of sociology. Terrorism is always also a cultural performance. Probably due to the influence of the French Revolution, which tried to place politics at the center of human existence, displacing religion, or trying to. Most 19th and even 20th century terrorism has been phrased in political terms. Ireland is paradigmatic. But politics, at least as politics is used in polite society, is never the whole story. It took the poet Seamus Heaney to teach the Irish that their nationalisms expressed more profound, essentially tribal, animosities, loyalties, and anxieties. The Good Friday Agreement only became possible when it was widely realized that political rhetoric also gestured towards yet deeper things. As a cultural performance, terrorist violence is often accompanied by words, sometimes offered as justification, even motivation, and in that sense, cause. Killers, however, may not have many grammars available to them. If terrorist attacks, including the accompanying speeches, are also performances, then they must be understandable by their audiences. The text must be legible. So killers are limited to what their audiences have heard. In Europe, we see the prevalence of the rhetoric of anti-Semitism, even in places without Jews. Anti-Semitism was to a horrific degree achieved, and yet the language endures, and when need be, can be used to ornament a killing. In the United States, of course, anti-Semitism has always existed and was voiced in the recent attack on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, for example. But race has always been the prevailing violent discourse. In the age of Trump, especially, it is perhaps unsurprising that mass killings are articulated in racist terms. Radical Islam can be used to narrate violence, too, obviously. Other contenders flicker on and off the stage, like the defense of the Constitution expressed by Timothy McVeigh when he bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building and its daycare center, causing 168 deaths and hundreds of injuries. An interesting aspect of the school shootings so common in the United States is the fact that violence is sometimes articulated in terms of popular culture. The Columbine shooters and subsequent shooters dressed like characters from the movie The Matrix. The recent release of The Joker, an origin story movie about the arch-fiend in the Batman Entertainment franchise, created a wave of anxieties that incel males, perhaps seated next to you in the multiplex, would be inspired to kill people. Of course, few people become mass killers. Study after study has shown that bad movies, or bad people in good movies, do not cause terror in any linear sense. People do not have many languages at their disposal that are felt to gain traction. If a school shooter talked like a wet British academic about the intractable immiseration caused by neoliberal power structures, what good would that do? Syrians and the French get jihad. People in Colorado get the Matrix. But this is in the nature of fashion, a sort of in-the-air availability. This is a disturbing answer. If terrorist violence is not really about Islam or the U.S. Constitution or white people's rage or Jews, sometimes in Palestine, sometimes just quote Jews, or what have you, then submitting to the demands of Islam, preserving the Constitution, making white guys comfortable, and so forth, will not make the violence go away. What is the violence about, really, and how is that to be addressed? What is to be done politically? Presumably, we will build a wall, but we do not expect the wall to work, at least not entirely. We may even sympathize with the watchers on the wall, as this book does, but that does not really address the question. With what attitude do we participate in an empire that is always already something of a failure, even as it is something of a success, at least comfortable enough for some of us, some of the time? On October 3rd, 2019, a man walked into police headquarters, Paris, where he had been an employee for over 20 years. As the New York Times recounts, shortly after noon, he calmly left his office, walked across a bridge, bought an 8-inch kitchen knife and an oyster knife, and slipped back into the police building. His colleagues in the office had stayed behind to have lunch at their desks. The killer slit the throat of one, a 50-year-old police major, and fatally stabbed another, a 38-year-old officer, in the abdomen. He then went into another office, stabbing a 37-year-old administrative employee, and descended the stairway toward the building's giant courtyard. Along the way, he stabbed to death a 39-year-old policewoman, the prosecutor said Saturday. Once in the courtyard, he threatened another employee with his knife. Ordered to drop the weapon by a young policeman, the killer first walked slowly toward him and then started to run, pointing the knife. The officer fired. The killing spree, the prosecutor said, lasted exactly 7 minutes. The man's name was Michael Harpin, and as usual, his story reads in many ways. French authorities did not initially release his name. He had been a convert to Islam, but police insisted that did not mean that he had been radicalized. His case was later turned over to anti-terrorism units. He was from Martinique and deaf and frustrated by lack of career advancement. Various radical texts were exchanged with his wife. He posted violent messages, some rooted in deaf politics, some more Islamic, on social media. He had been overheard defending the Charlie Hebdo attackers. He had been accused of, but ultimately not punished for, domestic violence. Relations between the French police and civilians have soured in the context of the Yellow Vest demonstrations of general discontent. On the Wednesday preceding Harpin's attack, the police staged a massive demonstration of their own. The force is suffering an unusually high number of suicides, over 50 in the year prior to Harpin's attack. No doubt some narrative, with some relations to the truth, will coalesce over time, but what are we to make of this? Against the sunny tradition of Enlightenment thought, a darker story, conventionally beginning with Rousseau, emerges, a story in which civilization, culture, is the problem. It is not merely that we are threatened by the state of nature and so submit to Leviathan. It is that submitting to Leviathan, life in society, is itself unbearable. Romantics and cultural anthropologists have always drawn on this sense that nature, for all of its horrors, would not be so damaging to the soul as the modernity in which we live in fact. The state of nature is not available to us except as a thought experiment. We live in society, and that often seems to be the trouble. Evelyn Waugh, speaking on the BBC in 1961, of P.G. Wodehouse's airy comedies. Mr. Wodehouse's idyllic world can never stale. He will continue to release future generations from captivity that may be more irksome than our own. He has made a world for us to live in and delight in. Waugh has his Wodehouse right, but it is hard to know what to make of the shadow cast by more irksome than our own. Perhaps it bears mentioning that Waugh had several extended homosexual affairs in the same England that forcibly castrated Alan Turing, the patron saint of both computer science and code breaking, who ultimately committed suicide. But perhaps Facebook has more suicides to answer for already than the anti-homosexuality laws of the United Kingdom managed to rack up during their tenure. Perhaps we are not progressing. As the legal scholar Grant McGilmore said, in hell there will be nothing but law, and due process will be meticulously observed. Can we live like this? Nietzsche speaks of the last man, so perfectly modern, so perfectly safe, worthy only of contempt. Weber speaks of the disenchantment of rational bureaucracy and the resulting turn to the charismatic leader. Freud wrote Civilization and its Discontents in response to the horrors, it would be banal to call them senseless, of World War I. Freud and Weber both died shortly thereafter and did not live to see Germany turn to charisma with a vengeance. All of this sounds overheated, and perhaps is. And as of this writing, however, in country after country, often angry charisma seems far more appealing than the sorts of bureaucracy that this book has sought to explore and perhaps even improve a little. And the rebellion, when it comes, is unlikely to look like an engagement with late Freud, and more likely to look like a man with a knife in police headquarters, or something much bigger. Since the collapse of Marxism as a viable form of critique, it has been difficult for North Atlantic elites to imagine that all might not be right with the direction of modernity, hence the end of ideological conflict implied by the oft misunderstood phrase, the end of history. By way of thought experiment, however, just suppose our progress is towards a society not worthy of affection, perhaps even to be loathed. Suppose capitalism, for all its flaws in which David teaches, is what makes society. Our legends come from Disney. All our friends are on Facebook. The culture industries give us all the culture we have, if not all that we need. Social media, that is, what passes for a community, is cursed. No doubt sins are being committed in our name, although we cannot agree on a list of sins. The gorge rises. At this point, many progressives feel compelled to say that the past was horrible, all vile isms and slavery and whatnot, which ends up being a very conservative defense of the status quo, along the lines of this moment should be loved, because other times and places were despicable or, in our idiom, are morally repugnant. The common defense of North Atlantic modernity is essentially, you wouldn't want to live among sinners, would you? You are not a sinner, are you? Progressive indeed. This conservatism can also be expressed in more historical terms. In the Middlebrow West, we frame issues in roughly the same way we have been using since the Renaissance. Prehistory, a lost classical age, a brutal Middle Ages, and modernity, now cosmopolitan and post-national. Violence and the political aspirations associated with such violence tend to be historicized and then cast as throwback to be defeated by the march of time. Anders Breivik must be denied because he suggests that Norway, modern cosmopolitan Norway, has to some extent failed. Who could not wish to participate in cosmopolitan Norway, or Europe? This is what Fukuyama, channeling Hegel, actually meant by the end of history. After the psychic collapse of Marxism, the inhabitants of advanced liberal democracies had little conceptual equipment with which to criticize their own societies, which clearly represented the future, indeed, the only future they can imagine to be possible. Understandably, the establishment has tended to deny accusations of failure, even if tacit, by externalizing them, often by claiming their accusers wish to return to an evil past. It is unclear what return means. Surely what is being contested now is the future. Nonetheless, various attacks are summarily labeled and dismissed as futile efforts to return to some prelapsarian past, maybe even a medieval Muslim one. Or white nationalism, racism tinctured with the sexism of the males who lost out on globalization. One need not physically attack anything to be called medieval. Voting for Brexit was widely held to be some sort of atavistic urge to go back to the past. All of this is somewhat tautological. If one saw the world in the approved cosmopolitan way, one would be satisfied with this understanding of history and one's satisfying place in it. One might even frame history itself in ways that position oneself as the desired outcome of the dialectic, she thought as she slid into her business class seat and ordered a bourbon. Suppose, however, one has an entirely different idea of the modern, or even of the significance of history itself. If the Quran and Hadith express eternal truths, then straying from them is simply error, not development nor evolution. Or suppose, relatedly, that modernity, however presented in the North Atlantic, just is not enough. One can express that thought with reference to Nietzsche or Weber, as above. Or there is this: I just couldn't live in Bratislava and serve lattes, said a head of security, Serbian, tall, bald, simultaneously friendly yet menacing, and with an adventurous past, by way of explanation. If what used to be disparaged as bourgeois suburban life doesn't satisfy, some people will seek out what does. Mountain climbers, opioid addicts, special forces guys, and terrorists. Wheelerbeck's submission artfully suggests that France has created a society so barren that one can imagine attractive contemporary Islam. Or, for many police officers, evidently, a bullet. The broader question is whether France, or the United States, or modernity more generally, has lost its way, and what fills the vacuum. What are the watchers on the walls defending? So the real attacks come from within. Waugh tries to understand why French youth convert to a foreign death cult. Americans just lose it and go to Walmart or set up a shooter's nest in a nearby hotel. The scary metaphor for such terrorism is modern bodies, under great stress, chemical and otherwise, in an antiseptic environment. From time to time, a cell flips out, becomes cancerous, and some individual shoots up a school or a mosque or an airport. The body, politic, usually successfully, eliminates it. Sometimes, as in, say, Germany or Somalia, the autoimmune system fails altogether. Or so it appears on bad days. Perhaps modernity is not to blame. Maybe this is merely the human condition, in that sense, nature rather than culture, our fate rather than our history, to be endured rather than overcome. The Iliad begins with rage. Maybe even more than war, rage is the subject of the book. War is the setting. When he was denied Briseis, Achilles kept to his tent. When he lost Patroclus, Achilles did not talk about Tondres. He slaughtered. From this perspective, whether or not rage is in ourselves or in our stars matters little. Either way, terror is not most importantly the expression of violent ideological logic, but instead an unleashing, a letting slip as is the counterterrorism massed against it. Civilization, indeed life itself, and maybe especially male life, involves frustration. Rage that is always in danger of being expressed one way or another. From this perspective, not only is ontological security an oxymoron, actual violence may be expected from time to time, like prime numbers, which are rare but in infinite supply. That said, this is a too one-sided and negative reading of civilization and its discontents, essentially a psychological internalization of the Hobbesian logic of Leviathan. External fear becomes internal rage at the oppression of civilization. There is truth here, but not enough. Surely people come together out of more than fear. Eros, encompassing not just lust, but the desire for company, maybe even love. Against Leviathan, 1651, we might read King Lear, 1606. The play is about bonds forged, tested, broken, reforged, and about lives defined and defended or attacked in terms of such bonds. There is little or no interest in self-preservation here. Quite the contrary, there is much willful self-destruction. The play is about nature, especially including love, not the flight from nature. The violence in Lear springs not from fear, but from courage, and from its forms of imagination, from Eros rather than from Thanatos. Tragedies are about virtues, often love, but are violent nonetheless. And if that is right, we should not even hope, with the sunnier and softer side of the Enlightenment, to expunge our capacity for violence, for with it would go love, friendship, familial obligation, honor of many sorts, and that existential need easy enough to disparage as vanity, but without which there would be little art, little science, little culture. Mostly, though, violence does not erupt. The cancer cell is eliminated or contained. Most people, most of the time, do not take up arms. Many societies are quite peaceful. Violence is often imagined, not just in the feverish planning of the secret college, but in games, movies, even old books. Society will find narratives that glorify violence. Race, anti-Semitism, honor, even counterterrorism. Let's all have a SWAT team. In U.S. culture, especially, militarization is often a form of style. A fantasy, certainly, but all style involves fantasy. Very tough trucks, Hummers, tactical clothing, guns galore. There are even good things about this. Military virtues are virtues. Achilles is a hero. Even Roy Lauer, Millwall, is brave. Not an angel, but who expected that? Whatever our virtues, we all have failings, sins. In fact, modernity cannot be understood without some acknowledgement of sin. This is the Peace of Westphalia, the entire liberal edifice of rights. We build structure, process, because fallen man cannot agree on the nature of the good and is willing to kill over the argument. From this perspective, liberalism or modernity, however defined, does not substantively transcend violence, never will, and should not seriously try. Instead, violence is the reason for the forms of the social we most readily acknowledge as modern. We therefore must seek to contain violence, to express the passions while avoiding as much of the bloodshed as possible, to allow for the carnival so that the ordinary is peaceable. Challenges abound. Perhaps we can build a society people love, so that ordinary unhappiness is kept to a minimum. Maybe we can limit the damage done by the narratives of violence, articulate the passion without letting blood. And perhaps our official violence can be conducted in ways less clandestine, more restrained, publicly legitimated, and worthy of respect than is now the case. There are many such questions, and addressing them would require other books. But the general question is, what kind of polity do we wish to have, and how will it cope with the violent possibilities entailed in our condition? Good, bad, or indifferent, the watchers on the walls, whether soldiers or bureaucrats, serve the polity that belongs to us all and to which we all belong. The question of what is to be defended is ours, not theirs. Here, politics begins with a latte.